My name is Gemma McCall, and I am co-founder and CEO of Culture Shift, the Tech for Good organisation behind the development of the report and support system. At Culture Shift, we imagine a future world of work and study that is safe, happy, and supportive for everyone everywhere. Our products empower organisations to tackle harassment and bullying of all kinds, allowing leaders to activate positive change in their institutions and maintain the culture they want. In 2016, we were asked to solve a major challenge for one of the UK's biggest universities. Statistics and headlines have shone a light on a dark problem plaguing campuses up and down the country. The solution we built was successfully implemented at the University of Manchester and has since been adopted by higher education institutions throughout the UK and beyond, transforming the way they identify, track, and address and prevent incidents of harassment and bullying. As of today, we are working with over 50 universities across the UK and Europe to improve and protect their culture. Before we start, I just have some quick housekeeping notes. If you have any questions during the session, please use the question panel at the bottom of your screen. Alternatively, you can email your questions to events@culture-shift.co.uk, and I'll be happy to put your questions to our guests at the end of the session. Please note our new Code of Conduct rules, which we have recently introduced, a copy of which was sent with the joining instructions for today. We do have a chat moderator who will be ensuring all participants are abiding by the Code of Conduct for a Culture Shift webinar. Please be mindful that some of today's content may be triggering, and so please be warned. We are recording the webinar today, and you will be sent a copy of the recording afterwards, so please take any time out if you need to. I'm delighted to be joined today by Mark Wright, Senior Associate at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and who played a key role as part of the Commission's inquiry team into the report. Mark has worked at the Commission since it was set up in 2007. He has worked on a diverse range of projects, from employment practices in the cleaning sector to businesses' responsibilities on human rights to prejudice-based bullying in schools. Prior to that, he was at the Commission for Racial Equality. Hi, Mark.
Hello.
I'm also thrilled to be joined by Dr. Nicola Rollock, an academic consultant and public speaker specialising in racial justice in education and the workplace. She is widely known for her research published last February, which examines the career experiences of Black female professors. Nicola is a member of the Wellcome Trust's Diversity and Inclusion Steering Group and the British Science Association's new Equality and Diversity Advisory Group. She was appointed Specialist Advisor in January 2019 to the Home Affairs Select Committee's Macpherson 20 Years On inquiry, a role she held until Parliament was dissolved in November 2019. Thanks for joining us today, Nicola.
Hi, thank you.
It has been 6 months since the EHRC published Tackling Racial Harassment, Universities Challenged. The inquiry into racial harassment in publicly funded universities in Britain was launched in order to examine staff and students' experiences of racial harassment and the effect they might have on their education, career, and well-being. They also wanted to look at the extent to which universities have in place available, accessible, and effective routes to redress for their staff and students if they experience racial harassment, and the findings made stark reading. The inquiry found that racial harassment is a common experience for a wide range of students and staff at universities across England, Scotland, and Wales. Around a quarter of students from an ethnic minority background said that they had experienced racial harassment since starting their course. 56% of students who had been racially harassed had experienced racist name-calling, insults, and jokes. 42% of students who experienced racial harassment during the 2018-19 academic year reported being subjected to microaggressive acts, and many students had experienced microaggressions on at least a monthly basis. Over half of staff who responded to the inquiry described incidents of being ignored or excluded because of their race. More than a quarter said they experienced racist name-calling, insults, and jokes. Much of this harassment took place in office environments, frequently in plain sight of their colleagues. 2/3 of students who responded to the Commission's survey and had experienced racial harassment so that they did not report the incident to the university. Less than half of all staff who responded to the call for evidence said that they had reported it to the university. Students and staff most commonly said that they did not come forward because they had no confidence that the incident would be addressed. Conversely, 43% of universities believed that every incident of racial harassment against students was reported, and 56% believed that all incidents against staff were reported. For many students and staff, racial harassment resulted in humiliation, isolation, loss of confidence, and serious harm to their mental health. 8% of students who had experienced racial harassment admitting to having felt suicidal. The most disappointing statistics outlined that 1 in 20 students said they left their studies due to racial harassment. 3 in 20 staff said racial harassment had caused them to leave their jobs. Nicola, you summarised in The Guardian at the time that the report was published, that its main findings showed that universities were overconfident about addressing racism and that Black, Asian and minority ethnic students and staff suffer in a hostile environment. Did the findings of the report surprise you in any way?
Thanks for that. Well, there's a very easy and straightforward response to that question, which is no. I think what's really important in terms of the EHRC research is that it looks at both staff, so in other words, professional support staff, and academic staff, as well as students. Because quite often what we find in current debates or current policy debates is that the focus tends to be only on students. And really, I think there is a question about the environment in which students are being taught. And that involves also acknowledging the experiences of staff. But I also want to say something else in terms of why the findings didn't surprise me. And that is because the research builds on several decades of existing empirical research into this very issue. Just to give one example, when back in the days when we had the Race Relations Amendment Act, we had Professor Gus John carry out an assessment of the extent to which universities had a policy and were abiding by the duties under that act. So to my mind, actually what we're seeing is the continuation of exactly the same problems that persisted in the sector for decades.
Mark, based on the findings of the inquiry, the EHRC gave 10 recommendations. Can you remind us what the recommendations were, please?
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. I think, rather than go through the individual recommendations, just to summarise, we made a number of recommendations to universities, to governments, to regulators and to funding bodies. So, a diverse range of bodies across the sector. And those recommendations really focused on 3 core themes. One, about improving transparency on efforts to tackle harassment, to rebuild trust, both in terms of students and staff, and to create those safe and tolerant spaces for learning and for work. Secondly, as you highlighted at the beginning, the need for routes to redress, to be available, to be accessible to people, and to be effective, and for those to be informed by evidence-based approaches. And I think in terms of those evidence-based approaches, that means understanding the challenges within any particular university, but also evidence-based in respect of what works in tackling those issues. And then thirdly, around ensuring senior leaders take steps to embed those inclusive cultures where staff and students feel confident and supported when they bring complaints and raise concerns about issues such as racial harassment.
I just want to pick up that note actually about university leaders. I'll quote directly from the report. There needs to be leadership to help embed a culture where racial harassment is not tolerated. A lot of recent university action to tackle harassment has focused on sexual harassment. there was not the same confidence in talking about and tackling racial harassment. Students and staff said that policies and leadership commitments were often undermined by a lack of meaningful enforcement. Yet universities saw little need to change their existing policies and rarely, if ever, talked about the need for greater enforcement of those policies. There was a strong perception that universities too often place their reputation above the safeguarding and welfare of their students and staff. So, Nicola, how can university leaders create and maintain environments where racial harassment is not tolerated and where race and racial inequality is discussed competently, confidently, and constructively?
So, Gemma, thanks. I think I would like to just turn that question on its head, if I may, and ask the question, why hasn't anything changed so far? And I think there are two key aspects to that question. One, which might for some seem like a controversial statement, but it's important nonetheless, is that actually decisions and committees and the key fundamentals around race equality are actually led within the sector by those who don't have first-hand experience of the issues or who lack any specialist knowledge in the area. And that's something that actually I think we're terribly complacent at acknowledging and discussing as a sector and indeed wider society. So I think that's the first quite key point that I want to make. The second point is that actually there are no consequences to universities. And when I say consequences, I mean no explicit consequences to universities, be it positively or negatively, whether we're thinking about carrots or sticks, in terms of if they don't pursue a more racially just agenda. And I think those two areas we failed to consider sufficiently as a sector. So for example, and another way of thinking about this, for example, is to ask, what are those things which the sector does get exercised about? Where does it spend its time and its resources? And one example would be the Research Excellence Framework. And we can see how many universities start planning for that years in advance. And for colleagues who perhaps are on the line and not familiar with that, my very clumsy way of describing it is that it's something like an Ofsted for higher education in a very blunt terms. But you can see the resource and the time that certainly some universities spend in preparing for that, because it's attached to funding and it makes a difference in terms of what they can bring in to the university. And I just want to go back to my earlier point around consequences. I was very deliberate in saying there are no explicit consequences for the university in terms of either the carrot or the stick. But what I would say is that there are a series of other consequences, and they look like the attrition from higher education of Black and minority ethnic staff. We know from existing research that those groups are more likely to consider leaving higher education to work to work overseas compared to their white counterparts. And we also see it in terms of what we call continuation rates, so dropout rates for racially minoritized students, and particularly Black students after their first year of study, and then this persistent problem of what we now call the degree awarding gap. So in other words, the difference in the percentage of students attaining a good degree, a first or 2-1, so Black and minority ethnic students were often lumped together, and white students. So there are consequences, but I don't think anyone's quite joined up that our experiences within the sector also impact on success and outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. Mark, have you got anything to add to that at all?
No, other than to say, I think evidence of that came across in the responses, to the inquiry, that one of our motivations for looking specifically at racial harassment was that there has been work tackling racial inequalities in higher education, looking at diversifying the curriculum, looking at the degree awarding gap that, that Nicola talked about, but perhaps less recently, looking at that issue of that sense of belonging and the impact that that has on the points that, that Nicola raised about retention rates and success rates. And also, you know, the commitment, you know, that I think is probably genuinely there to diversify the workforce. But that disconnect between what's happening as a result of you know, staff experiences in terms of racial harassment, and you know, something of a kind of revolving door.
And
with those, with the sort of ownership. Sorry, go on. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, and just pick up on that. I think Mark's quite right. That, and I would argue that there is, if I were going to be generous, a conceptual lack of understanding in terms of what race and racism mean amongst those who are not subject to racism. And there's a shift. So I recall, if I can just personalise this for a moment and share an anecdote, I remember a conversation with senior white colleagues talking about Black academics leaving their particular institution. And their interpretation or framing of that was, well, we are a global university, we develop talent, and of course would expect it to move as where those jobs are located. Now, in essence, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that statement. But if we drill down and consider the fact that Black academics and Black senior academics in particular are underrepresented within the sector, then if your Black staff are leaving, it must require you to ask the question, why? What can we do differently? What can we do to retain them? And at the moment, that set of thinking, that way of thinking is missing, fundamentally missing from the sector.
And the thing is, like, I absolutely understand that, and it's tragic that people, that university leadership aren't worried about that more than they are. So how can we make them concerned about it, do you think?
I'm going to give that to my colleague Mark, and I'll come in afterwards.
Thanks for that, Nicola. Yeah, I think there are a number of things, and I know we'll come on to talk about some of the progress that's occurred in the 6 months since the launch of the report. And, you know, so I think one of the issues is understanding, particularly in England, the role of the Office for Students. So, you know, and I think it's widely understood that they have a key role in improving access to higher education. But they also have a really important role in terms of understanding, you know, the points that we were just talking about in terms of student success and progression, you know, and that is within their remit. You know, it's unfortunate that their consultation about, you know, how to kind of better hold universities to account for progress on some of these issues, you know, has been postponed temporarily, at least, you know, as a result of the pandemic and lockdown. But we know that will come back, and we're supportive of those proposals that are in place. But I think when the consultation is revived, I think one of the things in our response that we will be expecting to see is a rigorous evaluation a couple of years down the line to see what progress is actually being made. So I think, you know, that's one example of you know, a regulatory response that can look to drive and improve the pace of change, you know, on these issues in universities. Yeah, I think there's been a lot of coverage recently about what our universities will look like next year and going forward as a consequence of the pandemic, and particularly concerns about international students, and whether this agenda might slide down the list of priorities. For me personally, I think that competitive marketplace for students makes it ever more pressing that these issues are kept at the top of that agenda, in order not just to get international students back into universities, but to make sure that their experience is a successful and rewarding ones for both individuals and students, and similarly for domestic students from ethnic minority backgrounds as well.
Definitely.
It's going back to Nicola's point.
And I definitely see how the Office for Students is a regulatory body to hold universities to account for the students, but I personally am less clear on what the accountability is for staff. Don't know whether you want to come in on that, Nicola.
Well, to my knowledge, there is no single body. I mean, apart from one's union, if one chooses to join a union, to my knowledge, and Mark might well correct me here, there is no single regulatory body that represents the interests of academic and professional staff. And I think there is perhaps also a question about, if I may, Mark, the fact that we know that the EHRC has experienced significant cuts in terms of resourcing over the years. So I think there's some really serious questions to be asked about how we make sense of and how we foreground issues of equality more broadly, but then specifically also within the higher education sector. So at the moment, I don't know of anybody. I may have missed something in my 25 odd years of being an academic, some amazing body that's going to represent the needs of academics everywhere and relieve us from our workload. But as I say, that's not something that I'm aware of. And actually, if I might do a slight segue, but I think it's important nonetheless, I'm certainly aware, and again, Mark, this is more within your remit than mine, is that what I'm also aware of is that there is provision under the Equalities Act in terms of positive action that institutions, including higher education institutions, I'll start that again, including higher education institutions, are able to make use of. And my understanding is that most public sector institutions are not making sufficient use of that. And in fact, they don't fully understand what that provision means. And I think there is some scope, arguably, to make better use of that provision.
Mark, I don't know where you want to come in back on that.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I think generally the positive action provisions in the Equality Act, tend to be less well understood, and there's certainly not enormous take-up of those provisions. I think across the board, not just in higher education, and perhaps one of the things just to leave with people generally is to mention the work of Universities UK and the advisory group that has been set up to look at issues of racial harassment, to support universities to respond specifically to the findings and the recommendations of the report. There's perhaps an opportunity, if positive action considerations are not being considered, for that group to potentially be looking at positive action. I think Nicola's right, that there isn't a single body. There are a range of university unions that represent academic, professional support, staff interests across universities. I think one of the things that it's probably worth talking about in terms of staff, that earlier this year the Commission published technical guidance on sexual harassment and harassment in the workplace. And that provides further guidance around a number of the difficult issues that were raised by both universities and staff and students, particularly in this context, staff in the report. We can perhaps come on to talk about some of those a little later. And I know we're concerns, are issues that are, very live issues for you at Culture Shift in terms of reporting approaches.
Yeah, definitely. We will come on to that later, definitely. I think we're jumping about, but I think I would like to sort of move the question up of what progress has been made in the last 6 months since the report was published.
Do you want me to pick that up first?
Yes, please, if that's okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was just
sorry.
Fiona's comment there from Universities UK.
Yeah, that's a good. That's probably a good start, because she said that the advisory group will ensure. She will ensure that the advisory group will look into it, and that she'll follow up with both of you on that. But that's probably a good introduction to one of the main things that's happened since the report, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think that's what I was going to start with. That I think one of the most significant steps has been University UK's commitment to a dedicated programme of work on racial harassment as part of its broader Changing the Culture initiative. And as Nicola mentioned, I think what's particularly welcome about that is that much of the work around changing the culture hitherto has focused on student experiences in relation to sexual harassment in particular. So it's really welcome that this piece of work is looking at both staff and student experiences and needs. So that's been set up as a one-year advisory group to create guidance that draws on those findings. And importantly, it's chaired by the Vice-Chancellor at the University of East Anglia. Unfortunately, that is in abeyance at the moment because the situation that we find ourselves in. But we know there is there's a clear commitment for that group to come together and to continue to take forward this agenda. I think some of the other things that are worth reflecting, the Universities Minister in England has written to all university governing bodies, setting out that expectation that they show leadership on these issues. We've talked about the work that the Office for Students are doing around their consultation. Beyond the consultation, I think we welcomed the fact that Office for Students are looking at establishing themselves as a hub for both guidance and good practice. And I think that builds on a lot of the Catalyst funding and the approaches that have been tested across a number of universities. And then beyond England, the Commission has entered a memorandum of understanding with the Scottish Funding Council that is looking at strengthening compliance with the public sector equality duties and looking at supporting universities across Scotland. And similarly in Wales, the Education Minister has committed to setting out prevention and tackling of racial harassment as a priority in her next remit letter to the sector. I think just a couple of other things that I think are worthwhile talking about. We've all been expressing our support for the NHS and for NHS staff in recent weeks. And we heard really powerful accounts from medical students on placement about the racial harassment that they experienced. And we spoke to them, the BMA, the British Medical Association, during our evidence gathering. So it was really encouraging to see that they have published a racial harassment charter along with guidance for medical schools and for students themselves. And I think it was in March now that Bristol University, their medical school, became the first medical school to sign up to that charter. So there is work taking place in particular sectors as well as more broadly across the sector. You touched on the impact that racial harassment and other forms of harassment can have on people's mental health and well-being. I think most people will know last week was Mental Health Awareness Week. So it was really encouraging, I think, to see the updated step change framework from Universities UK and Student Minds in terms of the support that's available for universities and the encouragement for universities to have effective measures in place, addressing some of the specific issues and some of the specific recommendations, particularly around understanding and recognising that important link between racial harassment and mental health. And also in terms of how universities respond to racial harassment, through the support services that are in place, to make sure that there is recognition of the needs of staff and students with different characteristics, including those characteristics protected by the Equality Act. So that was really encouraging to see the sector responding to those specific issues and those specific findings that came through so strongly in the inquiry.
I'd just like to pick up on a couple of things, and thank you, Mark. And I should declare my hand. I'm a patron of the Advanced HE's Race Equality Charter. And I think that charters and memorandum of understandings can be extremely, extremely useful. But I also think we have to go back to this question of why have things stayed as they are for so long and why are they not changing? So one could make the argument, for example, and I think it's a strong one, that arguably every single university could have a charter, but yet the experiences of their Black and minority ethnic staff and students remain the same. So I think we have to be careful about acts and initiatives that can be perceived as window dressing and go back to this really fundamental question of what are the areas that really concern universities. So where is the interests or the interest convergence, if you like, for universities? And to answer that, I think there is an important role to be played. I've already mentioned REF, but also for funders. So we know that Wellcome, again, you declared my hand in my biog, but Wellcome have been doing some work examining research culture and asking the question, how fair is research culture and what can be changed and improved? But I think there's a role for funders more broadly, given that universities' income is based from students and funding. There's also, I would suggest, a role for the learned societies. So, the British Academy, the Royal Society and others, in terms of really putting their, I don't know what the expression is, their flag in the ground, I don't know, whatever the expression is, in terms of their commitment to these issues and embedding it within their practice, and also their assessment of who, for example, might become a fellow. So, can you become a fellow if you've done X number of references for junior academics of colour? So we need to see that kind of granular and very detailed level of examination, and that's necessary if we're going to see some change in this area.
Definitely. I hear what you're saying about window dressing, it is very sort of bold to say we're chartered, but what does that actually mean? And I'm going to bring it back to one of my questions that I had for you, Nicola. One of the recommendations in the report says that providers must enable students and staff to report harassment and ensure their complaints procedures are fit for purpose and offer effective redress. I'm just going to quote directly from the report, which said, within a 6-month period in 2018 to 19, 8% of all respondents to the student survey, which is an estimated 180,000 if scaled up to the entire student population, said that they had experienced racial harassment. One third of these students, which is the equivalent to 60,000, said that they reported it to their university. However, our survey of universities found that across all 159 publicly funded universities in Britain, they had recorded 559 complaints of racial harassment from students over a period of 3.5 years. This works out at only around 80 formal complaints every 6 months. So it shocks me that this even needs to be said, especially given the fact that we have been talking about this for years, and that our business is around reporting systems. But given that it's one of the recommendations, what can we do and what can the sector do to create an environment where people feel confident to make a report, where we can increase reporting levels and underline the fact that this is a pervasive and pernicious issue at universities?
Well, I think we'd need to, in order to answer that, we'd need to take a step back and ask, do universities, the people who lead universities, the people who make decisions within universities, and indeed even those chairing committees looking at these issues, do they actually understand what racism is? And I want to tease that apart just briefly, because I think that it's too common the view that racism only exists in those more explicit forms. I know we were talking earlier around the fact that if someone knocks you in the head and calls you a name based on the colour of your skin, then there is an immediate, one would hope, understanding that that is racism. Now that's an overt form of racism and certainly obviously needs to be addressed. But there are also more implicit forms of racism, the everyday racism, characterised by racial microaggressions. So these are slights and put downs that actually I don't think that colleagues do understand or indeed take seriously. So I think that that, first and foremost, has to be a really key initiative, a sector-wide initiative, and I would like to see Universities UK lead on this, a sector-wide initiative to really drive home what racial microaggressions look like. These are commonplace, and universities continue to fail to address that area. So I think the understanding is important, because ultimately, and I would say this when it comes to tutors in respect of students, but then line managers in respect of staff. Generally, those are the people that we would go to when we're looking for advice and support and guidance. So you're relying on their understanding of the issues and then their ability to take it forward. Now, if you already know that the institution doesn't have a good track record in that area, you're less likely to report it. So I think the issue of understanding needs to come first, but I would also encourage a sector-wide debate. Again, Universities UK potentially has a role to play here about, and I think it's already mentioned in the comments, around the consequences for not taking these issues seriously. I don't think that we can rely on goodwill, well-meaning, good intentions, all these other phrases that get bandied around when it comes to issues that affect the lives and success of people of colour. And if I may, I just want to share with colleagues a quote. So I read this, if people haven't read it, the EHRC report is not short. I think it's some 105 pages. And actually there was nothing in it that made me pause, apart from this, and I'll just share it with you. It's on page 35 of the report. And I'm mindful that Gemma did mention around potential of triggers for some people earlier on. And this is an international postgraduate student at an English university who says this of his or her or their experience. I started to feel frightened and anxious at university and lost a lot of confidence. I had to take a year out to recover. I had to pay for a counsellor to process it all. But I'm still not as confident as I was before I started university, and it'll take me some time to recover from the trauma. Excuse me, that was a UK national undergrad. This is an international postgrad, also at an English university. I just don't want to be brown anymore. I wish I could boil my skin off or bleach it entirely so people can stop looking at me like I'm dirt. Now imagine that you are at an institute, a higher education institute, where you've gone to learn, and your experiences are such that it leads you to wishing that you could boil your skin off. Something is going fundamentally wrong within our universities. Well-meaning is not sufficient. And indeed, I would argue that the existing policies that we have around E&D, equality and diversity, are not sufficient. If they were, we wouldn't be seeing or hearing these kinds of responses. I think it's tragic and a really sad indictment on the sector.
And just to pick up on those points from Nicola, that a year ago, a colleague and I were, knee deep in looking at the responses to the call for evidence, and those comments are truly shocking. They are not unique expressions. Some we had permission to use within the report, others we didn't. And I think, as I said at the outset, it was the profound impact on people's mental health and well-being and what that meant for their studies and careers. That was the most shocking aspect of the evidence that we gathered. And I think just to build on some of the early points that Nicola made there, I think this is very much about whole system responses, that reporting is really important, and confidence in reporting for people to be able to speak up, at least in the first instance, whether they are looking for action to be taken as a result of that, to provide that much greater transparency and to bridge that disconnect between the perception through looking at formal complaints numbers against the experience of staff and students that is so evident in the report. So that's a really important point, and that ought to be a check for universities to say that there is, to at least very visibly provide that evidence that there is something going on here that we're possibly not dealing with particularly well, and we don't fully understand, and ought to be a prompt for further investigation, further support, as Nicola was saying, to enable staff across the university to be able to have meaningful conversations about race and about racial harassment, but also effective conversations that are supportive and constructive and move this on in a positive way, as opposed to compounding some of the experiences that that we've heard about.
Definitely. Nicola, I don't know whether you want to add to that at all.
No, I think I've spoken quite a lot. I mean, other than to just summarise my position, which is I think there need to be consequences, and there can be a conversation about whether they are carrots or sticks, but I think that certainly we are at that point. I also think that we have to engage seriously with the fact that people making the decisions in our sectors are generally not those who have first-hand experiences of the issues or any specialism in the issues. And I would actually go so far as to say that any colleagues who fall into those categories should be obliged, who are wanting to work in this area, should be obliged to have some form of rigorous training or coaching before they sign up to committees Because again, remember my point earlier, well-meaning is not sufficient. So that they need some expertise. We can't rely on well-meaning as the basis for determining the life chances of people who look like me. So we need to take well-meaning off the table. It's not sufficient, but those people need to have some really fundamental understanding before they engage in conversations about that are aimed at changing the landscape of race and racism in higher education.
Definitely. I'm just going to say to the people listening that the chat is open to ask questions, and I will put your questions to Nicola and Mark if you would like to ask them. So before I kind of open, before I can go to questions from the audience, one of the things that I just want to talk about is reporting is low. The complaints process is not being used. This excuse, I'm going to call it, comes out a lot, I think, whether tackling, it comes out in this report in tackling racial harassment, but it comes out a lot in tackling sexual harassment complaints as well, that when people do find the courage to go through the process and get to the end of it, the victim survivor is unsatisfied with the process that they've gone through, because they don't find what happens at the end. They don't understand. They don't find out what the sort of result is of the investigation. And that is, universities talk a lot about the fear of breaching data protection law, and more specifically the GDPR, and it remains a huge blocker for satisfactory process for reporting parties. Has any progress been made to clarify the position with the ICO so it can kind of stop this from being such a significant blocker to people accessing justice, if you like, through process at universities?
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. And it's universities have flagged the concern about breaching data protection legislation, but equally it was a great frustration from a number of staff and students who've pursued a complaint that has then gone on to lead to disciplinary proceedings that they are not told the outcome of those proceedings, and I think that's damaging for a couple of reasons. For staff and students, it means that they often left with a feeling of a sense of justice not having been served, and an interpretation that no action has been taken. And it may well have been, and really effective action may have been taken, but that that lack of feedback meant that it was often perceived as the issue had gone away and nothing had happened. Which obviously acts as a deterrent to raising concerns in the future. But equally, it's a missed opportunity for universities, going back to the earlier point, for universities to be able to back up their commitment to tackling this issue, to be able to provide that feedback about the sorts of disciplinary actions that they have taken in more general terms, in relation to complaints that they have received. And again, that tends not to happen for the same reasons. And I mentioned earlier that we have published technical guidance around sexual harassment and harassment at work. What we've said in that is that universities in this context, employers more generally, may have concerns that reporting outcomes such as disciplinary action taken against the harasser may be a breach of obligations that it owes to the harasser. However, they shouldn't automatically assume that disclosure of a harasser's personal data will amount to a breach of the general data protection regulations. And it often won't if the university has been clear that outcomes may be disclosed, considered what grounds it has for disclosure, and acts proportionately in disclosing personal data, and that they should take steps to enable disclosure of outcomes to complainants where it's appropriate to do so. And it goes into the steps that universities can take to do so. And I know from our conversations with Universities UK that they have been in discussions with the Information Commissioner's Office. This is very much part of the agenda for the advisory group. And in fact, in University UK's response to the publication of the report, that was one of the key commitments, to look at providing greater understanding, clarity and support for universities on this issue. Because you're right, it's currently it acts as a deterrent and undermines confidence, I think, in universities.
It does, and it's weighing up data protection law and human rights law. You're asking those things to butt heads, and which one wins. And at the moment, it feels like data protection law, which is very important, is winning at the moment. But outlined throughout this conversation, that's not good enough because people are being harmed.
Indeed, and I think it's finding that balance between competing rights, the rights of individuals who've experienced harassment, and the equally important rights that individuals who may have perpetrated those harassments have. But there is a better balance to be found.
Yeah, definitely. Fiona's just mentioned in the chat that our president, Julia Buckingham, has met the ICO commissioner, Dame Denham, and they have agreed to work with us on this, which is excellent news. That someone has met a person from the ICO is just fantastic news, because they're just like a 3-letter body that I've never managed to speak to an actual human. So that's very good. Okay, so some of the questions that are coming in. There seems to be a dearth of training / education providers who specialise in race equality working within the sector. Can the speakers or participants recommend any providers who they have found to be effective partners in this work?
So, and again, more declaring of more hands. I co-designed and co-facilitate the Advanced HE's 2-day program called Leading Race Equality in Higher Education. So I strongly recommend that. But there's also other organisations. There are the business psychologists, Pen Candola, and there's also Cerulean Blue. There's a range of different organisations. I can't speak to all of them in terms of the details of what they provide, but certainly there are other bodies out there.
And I don't know with Mark whether you've got anyone that you're comfortable to share.
No, yeah, I was just going to promote Nicola's work there, because we heard from universities during the inquiry that they were hosting workshops with Advanced HE, very much the 2-day program, looking at those range of issues around things like white privilege, structural inequalities in this context, with the intention of supporting improved understanding, decision making, and conversations about race. Yet beyond that, I don't have any specific knowledge of particular organisations who are doing this well.
But I'd also just add very briefly, because I'm mindful there are more questions, that quite often, and I'm not making any judgments whoever asked the question, but quite often when I'm sat on panels and speaking on this issue, someone will ask a question of that nature, what can we do? Or I'm a white colleague, I'm wanting to support, what can we do? And I say, well, you've also got Google, So I would be reluctant to suggest training programs, and for those training programs to be seen as the solution, the overarching solution to everything. I think they can serve as a really useful foundation and indeed provocation in some cases to the issues, but they are a foundation. The expectation is that one goes away and continues working on the issues and continue reading. I think we are in a time where we are seeing publishers supporting work by authors of colour who speak perhaps in less academic terms, but we've also got academics work in this area. And I would encourage colleagues to pick up those that form of literature as well to encourage and support understanding.
And I think also, Gemma, just very briefly, we included as a case study Cardiff University's Race Equality Support Panel. And I think approaches like that are using the expertise that exists within universities to look at when issues arise, to help university formulate effective responses to some of those issues. So drawing on academic expertise, professional expertise in these areas. So I think there's a range of ways this can be progressed. And I think one of the really important things that needs to happen is for those approaches to be, to be tested, to be evaluated, and the learning from that to be shared across universities, in terms of what works, what's making a positive difference, but equally what's not working. And let's not, make some of the same mistakes that others have. Let's kind of build on that understanding. So I think that sharing is really, really important too.
Definitely. And I think that people are always a bit scared to say when something hasn't worked as well as they thought. But actually, we learn more from that than just the successes in it and it being straightforward. So I think it's really important to share when it's gone wrong and why. Just to move on to one of the other questions, one for you, Nicola. Do you think there is any benefit of league tables BME friendly HEIs, i.e. such as Athena Swan / Stonewall Diversity and the like?
So it's a great question. I suppose I'd want to tease out Athena Swan because we've got charters on one hand and awards, and then we've got league tables. So I think I've commented already on charters in that I think they can be useful, but they shouldn't be seen as sufficient. There's a danger that they could be seen as window dressing while people behind the windows are still suffering. And then we've also got league tables. Now, generally, if you ask any academics about league table, most of us will groan because they're usually used to kind of beat us into submission and work harder. But, I think there's an interesting question to be asked there, to be explored. So it's a great question. Insofar as some universities do sit up and pay attention and are concerned when the Sunday Times top list of universities is published, or the Guardian, or insert name here. So I think there is an interesting point to be explored around, should we have some kind of league table regarding race? And this is something that I've considered myself. Now, I don't think league tables are entirely reliable, but the sector pays attention to them. And this does tie back really neatly to the point that I've been trying to drive home throughout the course of this conversation, which is around the interest piece. So at what points where can we argue that universities are already concerned? Where do they spend their time and their resources? And where can we feed in or mirror similar activities when it comes to race? And it may well be that some kind of league table in relation to race might be, well, for some a carrot, for others a stick, in terms of moving the agenda forward on this issue.
Definitely. But it does come back to that, what can we do to make institutions care, because that doesn't seem like that's the case at the moment.
I think some of that is flipping the point that you made earlier about universities' perception of the reputational issue here to one of not exposure to issues, but the reputational advantage in being able to demonstrate that, you know, our institution, like every institution, faces challenges around racial harassment and other forms of harassment. And through positive steps that we have put in place, we can evidence the progress that we have made. And that then supports a different type of competitive advantage in, you know, seeking and promoting yourselves to students to be able to, you know, to demonstrate, you know, we have seen a reduction in, you know, reports or, you know, these types of activities. We have seen an increase in positive outcomes about how those behaviours have been tackled and students and staff have been supported. And that's part of, you know, our recommendations around greater transparency, you know, transparency not just beyond the university, but transparency to your own staff and students as well.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I've got another couple of questions which are directed to you, Mark. Anna said, I presume that EHRC will feed into the consultation, but is there a role for the EHRC to work much more closely with the OFS, given that the OFS may not have experience around equalities, racism, etc.? And she's also said, could you say a bit more about whether or how you were working with the OFS on these issues, and are you also working with the office for the adjudicator for HE on these issues?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Yeah, on that last point, we are not actively working with OFA at the current time. We have been continuing to talk, as we have done since actually before we launched the inquiry, with the Office for Students and others around this issue, and have continued those conversations. We will be formally responding to the consultation itself. I think in terms of that wider issue of being able to work with the Office for Students, it very much depends. It goes back to the point that Nicola was making, you know, that all of us, you know, have limited resources, and it very much depends on our strategic priorities. So that's not to say that we couldn't look to work in that way. You know, it's not a specific priority to provide that kind of direct support at the moment. One of the things that we are looking to do, and we have commissioned an evaluation of the impact of the inquiry for our own internal use, you know, to look at how we can improve, you know, the way we undertake and deliver inquiries in the future. There will be conversations with stakeholders across the sector, including regulators. So I think there may be some opportunity, you know, to influence that, but I don't think we are able to commit to working, you know, specifically alongside the Office for Students, you know, for example, you know, in developing that that guidance and good practice hub that I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think those are all the questions that we have from the people listening. Do either of you have anything else that you want to add before I call the session to a close?
No, nothing additional from me.
No.
From me neither, Gemma. I think it's just been really useful to you know, to air some of these issues and to hear some of Nicola's thoughts as well. You know, it's been great. Thank you.